Hi everyone, and welcome back to Busy Kids Love Music, the podcast where we explore the stories behind classical music, one composer at a time. I'm your host, Carly Seifert, creator of Busy Kids Do Piano, and I'm so glad that you're here today. Today we're starting a brand new 3-part composer series all about Antonio Vivaldi. Now, if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you might already recognize that name. We've actually mentioned some of Vivaldi's music before in past episodes, especially when we've talked about famous pieces that are inspired by nature. But in this series, we're going to slow down and go much deeper. In this first episode, we'll explore Vivaldi's life and background, his childhood, his family, and how he became one of the most famous composers of the Baroque period. Then in the next 2 episodes, we'll listen closely to some of his most famous music. And if you want to make listening even more fun today, I've created another audio treasure map for this episode. You can download it in the show notes at busykidstopiano.com/podcast/173. And as you listen, you can follow along and see if you can find answers to the questions hidden in the music and the story. Now, let's travel back in time more than 300 years to the beautiful city of Venice, Italy, where Antonio Vivaldi's story begins. Venice was a fascinating place to grow up. The city is built on a group of small islands connected by bridges and surrounded by canals instead of roads. Boats moved people and goods around the city, and music was everywhere, in churches, theaters, and public celebrations. Antonio Vivaldi was born in 1678. His father, Giovanni Battista Vivaldi, was a professional violinist. In fact, he played in the orchestra at St. Mark's Basilica, which was one of the most famous churches in Venice. Because Antonio's father was a musician, music was part of daily life in the Vivaldi household. Giovanni often practiced the violin at home, and he began teaching young Antonio to play when he was still a child. Antonio quickly showed talent. Many stories from the time say that he learned the violin so well that he sometimes substituted for his father in the orchestra when he was still quite young. Imagine being a kid and suddenly playing violin in a big church orchestra. Antonio's father didn't just teach him technique, he also introduced him to the world of professional musicians in Venice. This meant Antonio grew up surrounded by performers, composers, and the sounds of orchestras rehearsing and performing. But music wasn't the only direction Antonio's life took. During the Baroque period, many musicians worked closely with the church, and some even became priests. As a young man, Antonio studied for the priesthood and was eventually ordained as a Catholic priest. Because of his bright red hair, people in Venice gave him a nickname, Il Prete Rosso, which means the Red Priest. Even though he was ordained, Vivaldi continued focusing heavily on music. Over time, he spent more and more of his career teaching, composing, and directing performances. One of the most important places in his professional life was called Ospedale della Pietà. Despite the name, this wasn't a hospital the way we think of a hospital today. It was actually a home and a school for orphaned or abandoned girls. The students there received a strong musical education, and many became incredibly skilled performers. Vivaldi worked at the Pietà as a violin teacher and music director. He taught the students, composed music for them to perform, and conducted concerts that became famous throughout Europe. Visitors to Venice would come from far away just to hear the orchestra of girls perform Vivaldi's music. This environment had a huge influence on his composing. Because he had talented musicians to write for, he created hundreds of concertos, pieces that featured a solo instrument, often the violin, playing with an orchestra. Because Vivaldi was ordained as a Catholic priest, he took a vow of celibacy. That meant he did not marry and did not have children. However, this doesn't mean that he lived or worked alone. Throughout his life, Vivaldi remained very close to his family of origin, especially his father, Giovanni Battista. Later in life, Vivaldi also worked closely with many musicians and singers, especially the talented students at the Ospedale della Pietà, where he taught for many years. And in some ways, those students became a large musical community that he spent much of his life teaching, mentoring, and writing music for. There was also a singer named Anna Giro who worked frequently with Vivaldi in operas he composed and directed. She traveled with him and performed in many productions. Some people in his time wondered whether they had a romantic relationship, but historians today generally believe she was a professional collaborator and student, not a spouse. As Vivaldi spent more and more time teaching, performing, and writing music in Venice, his unique musical voice began to stand out. To understand what made Vivaldi's music so exciting and recognizable, we have to zoom out for a moment and look at the time period that he was living in, the Baroque period. Now, we've actually talked about the Baroque period before here on the podcast, and I'll link to that episode in the show notes if you'd like to go back and listen again. But let's just quickly review a few of the key features that make Baroque music sound the way that it does. The Baroque era lasted roughly from 1600 to 1750, and the music from this time often has some recognizable characteristics. First, Baroque music has a steady rhythmic drive, a feeling that the music keeps moving forward. Second, composers loved contrast. So you might hear a quiet section followed by a loud one, or a solo instrument suddenly standing out against the orchestra. Third, many pieces used repeating patterns or musical ideas that return again and again. This structure helped listeners recognize themes and made the music exciting to follow. Vivaldi became especially famous for a type of piece called the concerto. In a concerto, one instrument, such as the flute in the concerto you're hearing now, plays as the soloist while the orchestra accompanies it. The music often alternates between sections where the orchestra plays together and sections where the soloist shows off fast, virtuosic passages. Vivaldi wrote more than 500 concertos, which is an incredible number. Most of them featured the violin, but he also wrote concertos for many other instruments, including the flute, bassoon, and even the mandolin. Another hallmark of Vivaldi's style was his ability to paint pictures with music. His compositions often suggest sounds from the natural world, things like birds singing or storms rolling in, rushing water, or gentle breezes. And that idea of music telling a story or creating an image will become especially important in our next episode. Because in the next part of our series, we're going to explore one of Vivaldi's most famous works ever written, a a piece of music that captures the sights and sounds of nature throughout the year. If you guessed the 4 seasons, you're exactly right. We'll listen for musical clues that represents things like birds, thunderstorms, and even icy winter winds. So be sure to join me next time as we dive into the first of those concertos and discover how Vivaldi turned the changing seasons into music. Until that episode airs in 2 weeks, be sure to check out the curated playlist I created in the show notes at busykidsdopiano.com/podcast/173. And where you can also download that audio treasure hunt for this episode to see how well you remembered what you learned. And again, you'll find all that at busykidsdopiano.com/podcast/173. Until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and keep making music. Thanks for joining me on Busy Kids Love Music. Bye for now.